Fire-wise, we start off in much the same way. So we're going to do pretty much the same thing, 2 layers or 3, with different speeds, different scales, multiplied together, multiplied with a color, multiplied with the brightness, and flickering. So this block is going to be the same for fire. In fact, we can probably copy the whole thing. So you could just start out by doing this, select everything from electricity up to the lerp, and duplicate that. Be sure to change the parameter names. And then replace the texture with the fire texture. So that's that one. I'm going to take one layer away. I think 2 is enough. So we can just stick to these 2. Change the color to something more fiery, plus the brightness is very, very high here. Something like 8 works just fine, I think. Okay, so it looks like this now. That looks about right. And also it goes on and off, it's flickering. Perhaps it should flicker even more. Then we have to make sure that the fire only shows up when the character walks into the lava. And let's assume that the lava is always on height 0. So we need to detect when the character goes beneath 0. What we'll use for that is we'll use the planar map that we made, this one. And remember, it was set to clamping, so it doesn't tile. So everything on the right of this line is always white, everything on the left of this line is always black. We're gonna planar map this on the character in Unreal. So we're gonna say that everything under 0 should show up as black, everything above 0 should show up as white, and in between the two we apply the gradient. So there's a subtle transition from black to white. To do that, we need to know where in the world the character or the mesh, the material is applied to, is positioned. So we take world position, and I will build this underneath the fire part here, quite far beneath. It's going to be a rather big setup. So this is where it is in the world. Then I need to be able to offset the number, because the number is probably not going to be entirely correct. Or for example, perhaps your lava isn't on the height 0, perhaps it's on height minus 4000. So in order to get control over the exact position, I'm going to add a number to it so I can offset the height manually with a number. The number I add to it is, to my experience, 175 seems to work fine. So I'm going to add 175 over here. And I'm going to turn it into a parameter so I can easily change the offset via the instance. Next up, similarly as we have done before, this outputs red, green, and blue, x, y, z. We only need to know the height, we don't need to know x and y. So I use a component mask to filter out just the height. And then I set this to blue, blue corresponds to z. And then the number this outputs is too big, because again, this is in world units. So if the character is 4000 units above 0, this outputs 4000. And 4000 as a number is really big to work with in the material editor. So I have to multiply or divide that number to get to something smaller. So I'm going to divide the number there by, say, 150. So it is now made the number more workable, easier to manage. And then that's what I input in the UVs over here. And you can see this works. This is planar mapping the gradient from the side onto the mesh. And you can see the location offset works as well. If I change this to -40, you can see the darkness goes up on the mesh. So obviously if it's 256, it's the other way around. If I do -256, he's going to be almost all black. If I do +256, he's all white pretty much everywhere. So what we will do in game is what you can also do is you can animate these values in code. So if you want the fire to burn in from his feet, you can gradually decrease or increase this number during gameplay as well. I'll bring it back to 175, which puts it just above 0. So the whole character is white as long as he is above 0. And then we use the gradient as the alpha for a lerp. So I make a new lerp here near the end of the fire. The fire is B, and A is just a constant which is black, so just number 0. And then the alpha is indeed this one. I'm gonna pick just the red or the green channel here. Doesn't really matter, it's black and white anyway. But like that. Let's see if this works. That appears to work, although I seem to have flipped A and B around. So going back to the lerp and making black B, A is the fire. And then as you can see, when we now change the position offset, the fire moves up and down on the model. Can I type -150 or -250 for a moment? So it's entirely lit up. Also, I'm gonna bring down the scale of the texture some. I think it's too big. So it's more of this. And then the next step would be to, because right now it's just a layer on top, it's just fire on top of the character. I want to multiply this fire with the diffuse and the specular texture so it gets more embedded into the material. So it doesn't just feel like a layer of fire on top, but it feels like the fire is actually in the structure of the textures. So it takes the detail of the texture over. You could make a unique mask map for this in Photoshop, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to generate it myself in Unreal by combining the diffuse with the specular. So I'm going to make 2 powers, because I'm going to make a contrasted version of both the specular and the diffuse. So I have 2 powers underneath. And one connects to the specular, which is in the blue channel of the normal map still, and the other one connects to the grayscale diffuse. So the same grayscale we use here, we have the desaturation block used in the electricity setup. That one we also connect to the second power. Then I add a constant 1 vector to control the exponent of both. And let's start with 2 or something. That one looks like that. This one looks like this. So the problem with the specular is that it's the other way around. You can see this is pretty much the invert. This is the desaturated contrasted diffuse, which gets rather dark with a few brighter spots. And the specular, however, is the other way around. It's mostly bright with a few darker spots. So in order to bring these two together, I'm going to invert this one. There's something called 1- that inverts the input. So I'm adding 1- here in front, and then it looks like this. It looks nicer, I think, and then I multiply these two together. It's gonna be too dark probably, but if I brighten this up, it will look quite decent. We then multiply the result of this together with the fire, and that becomes our new A, which then looks like this. As it's much too dark, so I'm going to take the color here and bump it way up to say 200, And then we have this. Now if this constant here goes down, first of all, if it goes up, you get less fire. If it goes down, you will get progressively more and more fire on the monster. So this controls how much fire there is on his body. And what we will do now in order to make it even better is we're going to tie this number together with the position in the world. So I will tie this part together with this part, because that will gradually make the monster start burning more and more the lower he goes. We already have the gradient moving in, but this will also change the contrast of the texture the lower the monster goes, therefore the more fire he gets. So that will make it even nicer. So we will multiply this number with the number that comes from the divide over here, but that number is going to go under 0, which wouldn't be very good. So I'm going to add a constant clamp in between to prevent it from going under 0. And that goes there. And the result of that goes into exponent. Also, we never wanted to reach 0 altogether, so I'm going to make minimum 0.1. So we change the minimum allowed value to 0.1, maximum remains 1 as it was. Also, we're going to change the divide. It seems to work a bit better if you have a number of 750 instead. And that seems to do it. Now we should try this out in the level. It's kind of hard to see it in the little viewport here. It's easier if you can move the mesh up and down. So let's add this whole block into the rest of the chain. And see how it looks in level. So it looks like this right now. It's unconnected. And this should simply be added on top of everything else that was already in emissive. Also, by the way, the number that we used for the constant here, the constant used for the contrast, that should be a parameter. So I made it a parameter. And I'll make it the default scale of, say, 3 or so. And I'll bring this back to the value that it was at, and you can already see what's happening over here. So he burns more and more the more he goes towards the fire. So it's a much more gradual gradient now. His feet are all burning, but his head is less burning, and it's not just because of the gradient, that's also because we're changing this number over here in the contrast. Let's say 250 or something, or 500. 500 seems to work as a default value. And then indeed, let's add this on top of what was already there. So a new add, and I bring that add somewhere close to the end of it. Again, it doesn't matter if it's here or there. If you do 1 plus 2 or 2 plus 1, it's all the same. At this point, we're pretty much done. We have the entire material made here. And this is pretty much it. So next step would be, after we verified that everything works, quickly verify if everything works in the level. We will then have to set up the instances, and we will have to set up the material functions. I'm gonna bring this a bit together and then group it as emissive. So this entire thing is emissive. That's it. And also we haven't set up dissolve. So that's also something we still have to do. Let's first check in the level. So here's our guy. The body material is temporarily also assigned to the armor. We'll solve that later, but you can see if he moves away from height 0, which is somewhere here, he starts to glow more and more. until he's really on fire. And if he goes up, the glow starts to disappear. So that appears to work. His eye is working. If I temporarily enable the electricity here, the electricity is working as well.